Right, so I'm going to start off this morning with a question for all of you. How do you feel? How do you react to this statement? It's not a test. There is no right answer. So please just give your honest reflections, your honest answers. How do you respond to this statement? Let's imagine as a company, we say, we really want you to be able to bring your whole self to work. How do we all feel about that as a statement? Let me know in chat. Oops. We don't want to do that. Let me just reshare. Let me know in chat. Bring your whole self to work. How are we feeling about that? Wrestling with it. That's a good description, Victoria, like that. Irish. I like that from Rebecca. Reg don't believe it. Makes me feel like the kind of place I want to work. Great, Caroline. Some people saying they don't trust it. Some people saying, yes, I'm a designer. Our company isn't ready for that, but I would love to. That's interesting, Nicola. So you're like, well, I would like that, but I'm sort of not quite sure in terms of my company. It feels like it could be taken advantage of. Interesting. What an interesting set of reactions already to this statement. I thought I'd give this a test, see how we got on. Oh, Julia, good to know that we are fallible. I mean, crikey. At some point, we will do a podcast, I'm sure, on all of our mistake moments. There are no shortage of them. Angela, welcome to PodPlus. Really happy to have you. Good week to start. Last week didn't go quite so well, but this week we're back on track. Carmen wants to leave some bits at home. Interesting. A bit exposing from Sue. Never do it. You want to have your Emma in work and your Emma outside of work. A bit apprehensive. Relief to do your best. Only okay if you can trust this relationship between your whole self and trust. Interesting. Regretted it in the past. Yeah, if we've had bad experiences, that probably affects how we respond to this statement. We like the concept in theory, perhaps Ruth's saying, but maybe not the reality. It's not for everyone. One size doesn't fit all. Maybe we want a break from work stuff. Yeah, it feels like, well, we can't have some people doing it and some people not doing it. It's really like the idea, Serena says, but difficult to do if leaders are not showing it. What do we mean by whole self? Good question. Want to leave some bits at home. We want work to be a safe space, sometimes away from other things. Yeah. It's interesting. The reason I thought I would do this, it's a bit of a provocative statement, I think. And actually you can see in all of our reactions, it's definitely not one where everyone reacts in the same way. I think you saw about 2 or 3 years ago, lots of organizations starting to use this phrase. And it came from this desire to want to encourage people to feel like they could belong. And we know belonging is important. When you feel like you belong, when you feel like you don't have to pretend to be someone you're not, we know that's when you've got high trust. You know, that's good for people. Pretending is exhausting, is really draining for people. You get to burnout. So organizations started to use this phrase. And I was never sure about it, because I sort of thought it was sort of organizations telling me what they wanted me to do versus me making the choice about how much of myself I want to bring to work. And I think that's where we all started to get to this morning. Of course, the sentiment is a really good one. I don't think we want people to be pretending. We know that's draining, and we know that's really hard work, but also we still want to give people choice. And we want people to have that sense of one size doesn't fit all when it comes to vulnerability. We don't want to feel like we're telling people like how they have to show up. It's an interesting question. Do you know, this would be a really good exercise as a team, if you've got quite a high trust team, to actually say, like, what do we all think of this statement? That's interesting. Yeah. So Steve's saying it is draining if people want you to communicate in a certain way and that doesn't feel like you. Farna's saying, I'd love to feel safe to be able to do this. Yeah, this link to trust, really important. Okay, so we talked about in the podcast this week, this idea of selective vulnerability. And I think that word selective is really important when it comes to vulnerability for 2 reasons. I think, of course, we do want vulnerability, because the days of saying, okay, well, we all need to pretend to be perfect. We want to dispel this myth of our leaders or anyone in any position in an organization, we have to pretend to be perfect. I think we are much better if we are sort of imperfectly perfect. You know, we are all human. We talked about a mistake moment we had for PodPlus last week. That doesn't mean that we don't care. That doesn't mean that we're not committed. We're just imperfectly perfect. And so I think we want to be human. What vulnerability helps us to do is it recognizes that we're all humans, that organizations are made up of people with flaws, people who've got brilliance, people with all of their strengths. So that's why I think vulnerability has been so interesting over the past 5 or 6 years. We don't want our leaders to pretend to be perfect. We want our leaders to be imperfectly perfect. We want to show and to understand that we make mistakes, that things go wrong along the way. And that's really useful for all of us. It gives us all the confidence to be ourselves. But I think what happens when you get to selective vulnerability is 2 things. It gives you the confidence to do this in a way that works for you, and it gives you choice. And one of the things that we know, particularly about choice, is that when we have chosen something, we feel much more control. And the more control we have about our choices, the less stress we have and the more confidence we feel. So I feel like this could almost be a sort of circular diagram here where these all relate to each other, where we could be saying, right, well, if we've got choices, actually, then we feel like we can do this in a way where we've got more confidence. And then actually we can have more clarity about what's important to us. And these things kind of all help us. They reduce our stress. They put us in, probably what should go in the center of this is in control. If we are told to bring our whole selves to work, we perhaps feel a bit more out of control because we're like, well, I've not made that choice. That maybe reduces my confidence. I'm not sure, I don't maybe have clarity about what that should look like. How do I know if I'm doing it right? Those kind of questions. Versus if we think, well, actually, it's my choice about how I show up, when to be vulnerable, how to be vulnerable. I'm going to do that in my way. So I'm going to be confident about how I do that. I'm going to have clarity around that. And that puts us in control. And we love, as humans, we all love to be in control. We all have a need for control. So I like the idea that when we're thinking about vulnerability, we start with individuals rather than trying to kind of create something where we should all be following these things. And that equals vulnerability. And I've seen a little bit of that because I think there's a bit of pressure actually now on leaders in particular to be vulnerable, because there's been lots of chat about vulnerability in the past few years, almost like well, what's the checklist for vulnerability? And I think that really misses the point if that's kind of where we go with vulnerability. So I've got 3 coaching questions for you. And I thought we would do these together as a group because we always get so many good insights in chat. So let's start with this first one. Let me know in chat, what stops you from being vulnerable at the moment? So what gets in your way? What stops you from being vulnerable at work? And if this is your first PodPlus, please feel reassured that this is sort of everything in chat sort of stays in chat. If you ever want to be anonymous, you can always just private message me, but everyone's very supportive here. So hopefully it feels okay to share these kind of things. Being vulnerable about being vulnerable. Judgment from other people. Yeah, Rebecca, you don't want to be seen as a moaner. Judgment, that word judgment coming up a lot. Like what will other people think of us? Nietzsche, if you're unfamiliar with new team or new job, yeah, that's a really good practical one. And I think that's quite a smart one. You know, you're still doing some sensing. We would describe that, sensing what the vibe is before you decide what kind of feels right. You don't want to look stupid. Charlotte, that's a really good self-aware statement there. You don't want to go into oversharing, and you're going, well, I know that maybe sometimes I do that. So you've already got that sense of there's probably a tipping point where this doesn't maybe feel useful for other people. Ego, that's really good, Katie. You don't want to feel like you need help. You know, so it's like, well, again, back to that judgment thing. Are they going to think I should be able to sort this out for myself? Emma, yeah, admitting that you're struggling or you're burnt out can be career limiting, fear of getting it wrong, judgment, fear, lots of judgment is judging and judgment. Actually, let's just write that so I don't forget. Judgment is coming up loads from people, which again gets us back to the people we've got around us. Do we trust that they are not going to judge us, essentially? Or do we feel like we might be misunderstood, that people then might think, okay, well, actually, they're not coping. They can't do their job very well. If it serves no purpose, I'm not sure how it would move things forward. Yeah, Rebecca, that's a good practical point. That's something that I can imagine Helen saying, having spent quite a lot of time with Helen, like researching vulnerability. She'd be like, well, I'm not sure how it's going to be useful. So she'd be very practical and pragmatic about it. Yeah, Gina, might limit our chances for promotion or progression. So there's actually some pretty big barriers, I think, that get in our way. One thing just to think about here is there are moments where you might need support, where that support doesn't have to come from inside your organisation, but you do need some support that aren't necessarily friends or family. And so I think one of the things that stopped me from being vulnerable in one role that I did was exactly the things that you're all saying there. I was quite new into a role. I felt like I was failing. I sort of did need to ask for some help. And I did need that ability to have a very kind of open, vulnerable conversation. The best thing I did, but I waited too long to do it, and I always wish I'd done it a bit sooner, was then go and talk and have quite a vulnerable conversation with a couple of people who'd done my job in different organisations, people I really trusted as well. So I was sort of having vulnerable career conversations rather than curious career conversations. And as soon as I did that, I felt much better. I felt more confident. And it just didn't feel right to have those internally. I don't think there was the trust there. And I think I was worried about the judgment, but the conversation was very, very helpful. So that might be one thing just to think about, is if you do feel like you're struggling, you do feel like you're stuck, doesn't mean it's not useful to have the conversation. We might just want to think about the who. Let me know now, when you're thinking really specifically about vulnerability, what's the when? I like a when coaching question. I don't think we ask enough whens. When is it useful to be vulnerable? Let's try and think about, when is this relevant? When might we be thinking about some of the things that we're talking about today? Let me know in chat. When could this be helpful? Brilliant. Yeah, when you need help. When you're giving advice. Yeah, that's really nice, Charlotte. So signaling to people. I've had this challenge. I get it. I've been there. Role modeling behaviours to others from Caroline there, spot on. If you are never vulnerable, you are definitely signalling to your team that they haven't got permission to be vulnerable either. We know that the shadow that you cast makes a really big difference as a manager. And actually, just if you're in any position of influence and impact. So just thinking about, doesn't mean you have to all be vulnerable in the same way, but if you are never vulnerable, you are probably limiting the learning of the people around you. Because also, we know it's not true. Like we know everybody has imperfections. We know everybody has those flaws. So if we never see them or hear about them, it's probably unhelpful. Before tipping into a crisis, really nice, Ruth. So you're like, I can feel it, but I'm not quite there. Like calling a sort of preemptive crisis, using it to set an example. Great. One for me, which again might be useful to think about, is when I know that I might show up in a different way. This is something I've also seen from very, very good leaders that I've worked for. If you are quite a consistent person, and we want to be consistent, we want to show up in a sort of similar way, because if we're consistent, that means we are sort of being ourselves broadly. And I think I'm relatively consistent in terms of how I show up. I know that sometimes other things going on in my world or in my work that not everybody else might be able to see might mean that I show up inconsistently. Maybe I'm more direct than usual, more blunt than usual, maybe less supportive, or maybe I'm not sure how I'm going to show up, but I know there's some things going on that might mean I show up a little bit differently. Those are often small moments of signalling that can be useful. So that could literally be as small as, I had a bit of a nightmare with my son Max this morning, ... happened. Like, happens all the time. And actually the team maybe just knowing that might be like, okay, well, Sarah's probably just needs a bit of recovery. She's clearly had a slightly more stressful morning than she'd anticipated. She might just need a couple of hours just to kind of refine her focus, sort of settle down again, and then she's probably fine. But that might not be the time to ask me a really difficult question, or it might be the time to just give me that little bit more space. And I have had an example for anyone who's listened to the podcast this week, where I had a conversation with my boss where I was like, this is awful. I don't know what I've done wrong, but I've definitely done something wrong. And it was just like a phone call between me, my boss, and procurement. It's so funny how I can really remember this conversation. And I just came off it being like, oh, I thought she thought I was good at my job, but obviously she doesn't. She sounded really unhappy with me on that call. And I got into the office and I did have a really good relationship with her. So I trusted her enough to just ask her. I sort of said to her, I was like, oh, it felt like something wasn't quite working on that call earlier. Is there something I need to think about that I've missed? And I did make it all about me. I assumed it was my fault. And then she just told me that, I mean, she'd had an absolutely horrendous couple of days with like actually stuff to do with her kids. And she said to me, do you know what, in hindsight, I brought all of that into that meeting. And I was just so relieved. I was like, oh, okay, so I'm not losing my job. I've not made a career limiting decision. And she said, actually, do you know what, I should have just mentioned it. Because but you know, it's hard to do that sometimes, isn't it? It's hard to do that in the moment. So I was really glad that I asked. Otherwise I would have, as a thinker and a reflector, I would have carried that with me. So, you know, if something ever feels a bit off, it's always okay as well to ask, like, oh, that didn't feel as collaborative as we would, you know, normally be, or they felt like there was something not quite working. That's often what Helen and I will say. Something didn't feel quite right about that conversation or about that moment. So what's going on? Is there other stuff going on? What's the challenge? Yeah, you automatically blame yourself. Yeah, so just be careful about doing that. And then let me know in chat. Appreciate it might not mean loads, but you might have some examples of people that we all know. Are there any who's? Are there any who's, people that you look at and you think, well, they are vulnerable in a way that I admire? So just think about this maybe in your organization. It could be people like we see in the public eye who are vulnerable in a way that we think, okay, yeah, I find that actually inspiring and I find that useful. Yeah, Brené Brown, the queen of vulnerability. I would say I listened before we did this podcast to her episode with Adam Grant, her podcast episode with Adam Grant on the TED podcast. And I really liked sort of how nuanced actually that conversation is around vulnerability. Sometimes, a bit like any concept that gets popularized, people are a bit sweeping about vulnerability, but if you actually listen to her talk about it, she isn't. She's actually very specific. She's not just going, oh, we should all just be vulnerable all the time. She really gets into the detail of like, what does this look like? And also, it doesn't just give you permission to do anything all of the time. So I was potentially a little bit skeptical before, and I was like, actually, no, this is good. This is really useful. Let's have a look. Who else we got? Previous employer. No one ever shared any vulnerability, Katie. Oh, brilliant. But your current boss did talk about having anxiety and it's been a game changer. Amazing. Just shows you, doesn't it? Like one example ends up changing your perspective. CFO talking about mental health. Brilliant. Leaders in organizations. This goes back to the shadow that they cast. People who've got medical conditions who are open about it. Oh, yeah. I often think about this. I always grapple with this. I'm somebody, I suffer with really bad migraines. And when I get migraines, I mean, I literally disappear off the radar because I can't even get out of bed. And I always have really struggled a little bit to share kind of what that feels like, because I'm so busy grappling with having a really painful migraine that I sort of struggle a little bit with going, how do I describe this in a way that's useful for other people? But also, I don't need to describe it too much because I would never wish it on anyone else. But also, I sort of think, at what point am I I think it was Charlotte's point earlier, at what point am I oversharing in a sort of unhelpful way? And sometimes that stops me sharing anything. So over time, I've got a bit more used to going, oh, when I get a migraine, basically, this is what happens to me. I have at least a day or a couple of days where I'm completely out of action and usually in a lot of pain. And it usually takes me a day or so to sort of find my way back to work because my head's all cloudy. And also I've taken some very, very strong drugs, which genuinely make you hallucinate. So I sort of try and describe sort of a little bit in quite sweeping strokes what that feels like for me, just so the team gets it. And then that's it. Yeah, they are the worst. Yeah, and obviously you do also have to cope with things like people just going, oh, is it like a bad headache? And you're like, well, not really. I wish it was like a bad headache. But obviously, if you've never been there, you perhaps just don't, you don't have that understanding. So it's good just to keep testing out. Oh, that's nice, Charlotte. Migraine hangover. Oh, that's a really good description, Dan. What's brilliant about that is most of the people have had a hangover. And that's actually, I'm going to start using that phrase. That is a great phrase. So again, sometimes just sharing things, people can help you find the words. They can help you find the language in a way that is helpful. Lots of people talking about mental health. This is where I think if you've got mental health first aiders in your organisation, that can be brilliant. We've got lots of mental health first aiders in Amazing If, and people actually then just sharing, because we all have mental health. And there are all times where we struggle with our mental health. So actually hearing, even if it's just some people's career lows, I think can be really useful. So hopefully some good coaching questions there to get you started. And just think about your vulnerability rating. So these were the 4 areas that we talked about, which is where you start to get into. Vulnerability is more than just talking about the hard times. I think sometimes we might default to it just being that, but it is also about, do we feel vulnerable enough to be able to speak up? Like, do we feel like we can speak if something's not right, or if we're worried about something, or we think some behavior like isn't acceptable? Do we feel, we've talked about this a lot already today, I think there's a strong relationship between this. Do we feel like we trust others? So really hard to be vulnerable if we don't feel like we trust others. That's where I would go elsewhere. Shouldn't stop you being vulnerable, but you might not want to be vulnerable kind of where you are. The resilience to keep going. That's part of being vulnerable. This didn't work. And, you know, maybe being able to say that, you know, the sort of learning, the mistake moments, the learning from your failures, the, you know, I am disappointed. I was hoping this was going to happen. It hasn't, you know, how are we going to keep going? How am I going to keep going? And living in line with your values, which again takes vulnerability, because you are basically saying, these are the things that motivate and drive me. Am I living in line with those things? And actually being confident enough to do something about it when you're not, when there's some sort of values clash, or there's some sort of tension with your values. There is a great quote from Brené Brown about values where she talks about, I won't do it accurately, but she said, like, the single best action that you can take is to try and live in a way that is aligned with your values. To always be kind of using a bit of your values as a bit of a filter for how you're living both day to day, but also a filter for your future. Yeah, I do think those last 2 are connected. I actually think they probably all are. Again, back to kind of circles. You sort of go, each of these sort of help each other. If you're in a high trust environment, much, much easier to speak up. If you're in a low trust environment, like really hard to have the confidence to do that. Lovely, Sam. Curiosity and humility. And you try and use those to sort of leave you forward in a positive way. Emma Gannon, yeah, she does talk about that. She's got a new book out, Emma has, called The Success Myth, which is really interesting if you are trying to figure out, what does success mean to you? I actually had a group yesterday from Lego, and one of the things that we were doing was writing our work in progress success statements. Like, what does success mean to you in your squiggly career? What's the 3 lines that sum that up? What's the 4 words? What's the diagram? Everyone in the room did something slightly different. So I love seeing what people came up with. But maybe like start to think about that. That also helps you a bit with this idea of vulnerability. I think it is just out, Julia, this week. I did actually see an advance copy. The advantages of writing books is that other people send you books, but it is out this week because she's been talking about it, I think. Let's talk about some ideas for action now around how can we be selectively vulnerable. I think firstly, just avoid this phrase if you can, the I'm fine phrase. You might already do this brilliantly, but both Helen and I, as people, I would say, who we love the work that we do, and I wouldn't say either of us naturally bring loads of vulnerability to work because we're too busy sort of focused on the work. And Helen in particular will talk about this. I mean, I've never heard anyone say I'm fine as much as Helen when she is clearly not fine. But her I'm fine is just actually what she is signaling is, I don't want to talk about it. Now, for her and I, it's very different. We know each other really well, and we're sort of friends first, business partners second, but less useful if Helen does this for everybody in our team, because they might go, well, she's saying she's fine, but maybe she's not. She's clearly not fine. Every time she says this, she's clearly not fine. And so just trying to go, well, how do you go beyond I'm fine? Maybe into just sharing kind of feelings, maybe going into sharing what would be helpful. And I know Helen won't mind me sharing this because she shared it on the podcast. So she recently had some health things she had to like figure out. And rather than just saying I'm fine, when we all knew she wasn't fine and she was in time and uncertainty and figuring stuff out, she would just say, I'm feeling loads of uncertainty at the moment, but actually what's helpful for me is to not talk about it now because actually I can't share anything because I don't know anything. So let's just focus on what we need to do. But when I know more, I will share it. And then everyone sort of goes, oh, okay, because everyone's worried about her. And if she doesn't do that, it's distracting, because then we just spend our time worrying versus going and knowing that she's not fine. So what are you feeling and what is helpful for you? Quite a good sort of short framework for quickly sharing, and maybe making sure you don't overshare as well. Yeah, so feeling and helpful. I like that as well. I find that useful. Next, think about what is useful in terms of boundaries. So thinking about boundaries, what is useful for you, but also what is useful for your organization, maybe what is useful for the people that you work with. And so, yeah, Lucy, it's a really good phrase. When I know more, I'll share. So you know it's coming. It's not that they're not prepared to share. It's just, they just don't know yet. So useful boundaries. I do think you've got to do the hold two ideas in your head at this moment. So you've got to think, what is useful for me, so that I can work in a way that works for me, but also try to think about what might be useful for other people. Sometimes those two things are not the same. And you might have to push yourself to be slightly more vulnerable than you might ideally want to be. That's definitely the case sometimes for me, where I sometimes go, well, I find it easier to not be. Sometimes it's easier to not be vulnerable than it is to be vulnerable. But you recognise, yes, but it would be useful to share a bit, or a bit more than I might normally want to. So I do find useful boundaries helpful. Signalling. So this goes back to, yeah, what do I need to signal? The thing I have practically got very good at, because I've seen it done, so I've seen it role modelled, is just those small bits of signalling. Today's been a bit of a nightmare. This has happened. This is, like stuff is going on that might just then impact my ability to do an absolute brilliant job today, or just to be consistent with how you normally see me. So just think about how you signal. And then one of the other things I was thinking about actually this morning is the Good Enough podcast that we did recently, this good enough mindset. If we go back here to trusting other people, to having the resilience to keep going, to speaking up and to creating trust, having a good enough approach means sharing things that are work in progress. And that takes trust and it takes vulnerability. This is maybe more about work rather than a lot of vulnerability. We feel like we're talking about us. But if we share work that is work in progress, I find that vulnerable. I'm always like, well, what is someone going to think? What happens if they don't like the idea? That's vulnerable for me to do those things. And so the good enough mindset, I think, actually does link to vulnerability. More about your work, being vulnerable about your work, as well as being kind of vulnerable about yourself. So I think useful for us to start to think about this as well. Vulnerability doesn't always have to be to do with your kind of personal life, or maybe to do with your kind of feelings. It could be to do with like the work that you're doing. And these sort of link a bit, don't they, to resilience as well. That resilience to kind of say, maybe sometimes this is not good enough. This is not where I'd like it to be. This has not gone well. Maybe the resilience to keep going. Well, actually, how do we get to something that might be good enough? Like, how do we move forward? Anything as well, last thing you can do to do this as a team, I think is really helpful. To just talk about how do you create the space so that everybody can be selectively vulnerable. No expectation for that to look and feel the same for everybody. But maybe there are some coaching questions, maybe some of the tools that we've talked about today, maybe some of the shortcuts. I'm feeling ... It would be helpful if ... Those sorts of things. So you just get the permission and you create the space so that people can be vulnerable in a way that is useful and comfortable. That's everything for today. Thank you so much for the people who are joining for the first time. I hope you found that useful. That's our number one value, so I hope we're living in line with our values. And no PodPlus next week. We actually do know that we've got no PodPlus next week because both Helen and I are going on holiday to places beginning with W. Everybody in our team genuinely is going on a holiday to a place beginning with W. I'm going to Wareham. Lucy and Helen are going to Wales. We're all going to places to do with W. I wouldn't mind going on holiday to Wandsworth, to be fair, Charlotte, because I like Wandsworth. So no PodPlus next week, and then we'll be back the week after. Oh, next week's podcast is with Rob Joffe. He wrote the book, Why Should Anyone Be Led By You? My number one leadership book. It is worth listening to that episode. People don't listen to our Ask the Expert episodes as much, which I like to take as a compliment, but please listen to Rob. I've wanted to get him on the podcast for ages. He's really good and a really good perspective on leadership, I think. So please have a listen to that. And then the week after we are doing senior people, how to get support from senior people and sort of how to have an impact with senior people. So that'll be the next PodPlus. Have good holidays for anyone who is off next week, and we'll see you all in a couple of weeks' time. Bye, everyone.